Hello, this is Tommy Franks. Welcome to the 4-Star Leadership Podcast, a product of the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum. We're here to get a view into the lives of the legacy makers, the movers and the shakers of today, to offer insights from the full spectrum of the leadership community. We'll talk to former 4-star students and explore their leadership development path. We'll work to find out what they are about today and learn from the opportunities they've made for themselves in this world. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this podcast. Remember, leaders are not born, they're developed.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Core Principles of Leadership with General Tommy Franks. I am your host, Delise Travis. We're on episode number 18 with our guest, Jack Jacobs. We'll be talking about community and leadership. But before we get into our program, we'll have a word from our major sponsor, REI Oklahoma.
REI Oklahoma is proud to be a part of the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute in the production and distribution of these podcasts designed to inspire leaders and difference makers. At REI Oklahoma, we have been working with small business leaders, entrepreneurs, and people who are driven to succeed for years. Highly motivated people working to own their own businesses, live in their own homes, and make the world a better place. Since its beginning, REI Oklahoma has continued to identify hurdles and deliver holistic solutions to create job growth and help neighborhoods thrive in both rural and urban communities. REI Oklahoma looks forward to visiting with you about helping your business and community grow. Visit reiok.org or call 800-658-2823 to start the conversation.
The LaBar family is a fourth-generation Oklahoma family. That may not sound like a long time, but our grandfathers were born here, within the Comanche Nation, before the land grants. We are the proudest sponsor of the Tommy Franks 4-Star Leadership Podcast. We hope listeners will heed the words of these distinguished men and women who have served our country at the highest levels and across all walks of life.
Jack Howard Jacobs is a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and is among the most highly decorated soldiers from the Vietnam era, having earned 3 Bronze Stars and 2 Silver Stars in addition to the nation's highest combat decoration. Jack is a retired colonel in the United States Army. He serves as a military analyst for NBC News and MSNBC and previously worked as an investment manager and has authored 2 books. Jack often speaks on topics based on his experiences. In this episode, Jack takes us back to his childhood and the community that built his character, his ability to lead, and the trajectory of his future. Good morning. Here we are with Jack Jacobs today, and he is a very interesting personality, very interesting person that has done and been a lot of places, achieved a lot of things, and has a great story to tell, and in particularly leadership. So, Jack, can we, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Very well.
Good. And you are in, where are you located right now?
I'm in New Jersey, in a small town in Somerset County, and people think of New Jersey as being crowded, and it is. It's the most densely populated state in the country, and yet I'm on top of a hill in the middle of the woods, and I can't see any of my neighbors. So it's not a bad combination to be in a place where you can get to almost anywhere relatively quickly and still not see any of your neighbors.
That's great. I know sometimes the solitude is nice so we can regroup, and then being easily accessible to any wants or needs and that type of thing is really great. Jack, would you start out telling us where you were born and a little bit about your childhood and your family?
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York during the Second World War. When my father came home from fighting in the South Pacific, he was in the Army. I was already about 8 or 9 months old. He'd never seen me. My sister was born probably exactly 9 months after he returned. So I've got a sister about 2.5, 3 years younger than I am. Started off in Brooklyn in what is now Bedford-Stuyvesant, and then moved to a Utica hut in Queens across the Grand Central Parkway from LaGuardia Airfield in a building that had been used to store aircraft repair parts during the Second World War. They put a partition in the middle of it, bathrooms at either end, and the small tin building was shared by two families. And there were several of these. In the late 40s, they built these city projects, apartment projects, and veterans could move into them. It was all subsidized housing. And I think we paid something like 25 or 30 bucks a month for an apartment in Long Island City in Queens. I went to PS 83 in Queens, public school. And then in the mid-50s, they threw us out of the projects. If you made more than about $2,000 a year, you couldn't live in subsidized housing. My father was an electrical engineer working for Western Electric, which was the manufacturing arm of Bell Telephone. And in the mid-50s, they threw us out, along with other people. The economy was growing, and a lot of people were doing well, and they needed to make room for people who weren't doing so well. My parents bought a house in Woodbridge, New Jersey, for which they paid $16,000, and they lived there until they died. I went to Woodbridge High School in New Jersey, and then subsequently went to Rutgers University, another public school. Back in the days when public schools, both primary and secondary schools, and universities gave you a terrific education. I'm not so sure that that's the same thing now. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't. But back then, everybody got a very good public education.
Well, thank you for that. That kind of tells us a little bit about you. It was a really different time. I know that that probably had a great impact on you. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how that impacted you? And then also, when you went to Rutgers, how did you decide to go into the Army? What inspired you to do that? Was it your dad? Was it?
Well, the communities were very close back in those days. And it's interesting to note that everybody had something in common. Every household had done something during the war. I don't call any of my friends having fathers who had not served. I had friends whose fathers were missing arms and legs and eyes, and I had friends who had no fathers at all because they'd been killed in action during the Second World War. So everybody had something in common. The community had something in common. And that's not the same thing now, more's the pity. And so it didn't really matter whether you came from a really classy background or were working class. Everybody had been in it together. And we shared this common bond of having parents who had sacrificed to save the world. I came into the Army through ROTC, and I did so for a couple of reasons. The first was that I'd done something that didn't make a great deal of sense then and still doesn't in retrospect. I got married when I was very young. I was 18 years old. And in the second 2 years of ROTC, they paid you $27 a month, which wasn't even a lot of money back in those days, but 27 bucks is 27 bucks. And it was comfortable to make a few dollars while I was going through school. As a matter of fact, I went to college full time. I had a full-time job in a restaurant, and I also had a part-time job in a slaughterhouse. So I was working all the time. I was going to school full time and had two jobs outside of school. It imbued me with a sense of understanding that you had to work in order to make ends meet. And that has made an impression on me, and I've made sure that it made an impression on people, young people in particular, I've run across. The second reason I joined ROTC is that I was going to go into the Army. I'd made a commitment to myself when I was relatively young, and the reason was my father. He had served, reluctantly, by the way, but I thought then, and I still think today, that everybody who's lucky enough to live in a free country owes it something in the form of service. And I was going to do my bit. I was going to do my 3 years and then get out and go to law school. But I stayed. I stayed in the Army because I really loved the people and I didn't want to leave them. And today when people ask me, what do I miss most about the Army? I've been retired from the Army for a long time. I tell them it's the people. I always feel better when I'm around people who have served and people who are serving. And it really motivated me to stay in the Army. The irony is I thought that going to West Point was the people who were going to stay in the Army for 20 years. Instead, I went to Rutgers and stayed in the Army for 20 years. Something of an irony. My father had gone to the University of Minnesota studying electrical engineering. And I think something like 6 weeks before he was to graduate, he got dragged. He and everybody else got dragged out of school to go join the Army. He hated the idea of going into the Army, hated getting dragged out of school before he was to graduate, hated getting shot at. Nobody likes getting shot at. And yet when he got to be my age, all he and all of his friends would talk about was how proud they were at having saved the world. And they had saved the world. That made an extremely big impression on me and a lot of people with whom I grew up. So I was going to go serve, do my bit, but I stayed because I loved the people. But it was my father's and everybody else's service during the Second World War, which motivated me to do it in the first place.
And I can see that. I think that there, as you said, there is a sense of community within your family and with the community that you lived in. And also you would have found that in the military, a great sense of community and brotherhood where you take care of each other. And would you say that was kind of reflected in the military, what you saw as a child growing up in your community?
Yeah, it was a pretty easy segue to go from a community that was close to the Army where the community was close. And I remember when I was young, there was always somebody's mother hanging out of her window, keeping an eye on the kids who were out playing in the streets or in the back of the building. It's almost as if somebody had a duty roster and mothers were assigned times when they were hanging out the window, keeping an eye on everybody. It was really bad news if your mother ever saw you doing something wrong. It was much, much worse if somebody else's mother saw you doing something wrong. There was hell to pay. And there were a couple of reasons for this, not the least significant of which was that you embarrassed yourself and your family and your community because you were all in it together. Yeah, it didn't matter what your background was. We were pretty close. And so going from an environment like that into the Army, where everybody was close, was the easiest thing in the world to do. And I think a lot of veterans back then, and particularly today, when there is no service, we've outsourced the defense of the Republic to a very small number of young men and women who are willing to do it. And most Americans do not know anybody in uniform. In that kind of environment, if you've been in the military, where everybody's taking care of one another, and all of a sudden you're not in the military, and nobody around you has had the same communal service and sacrifice experience that you've had, you feel at sea. That wasn't the case when I was young.
I see. And our core principles of leadership through our leadership program are caring, communication, common vision, and character. And I think I would say, and I think you would agree that your community growing up and your community in the military covers all three. Everyone cared about each other. There was a great sense of community and a great sense of accountability to each other. So that it was a great environment, I would say, for leadership. Would you say?
Yeah, I think most of the people who grew up in that kind of environment had absolutely no trouble whatsoever being successful when they got out of the service, because they learned at a very early age what authority and responsibility is all about. There's nothing like military service that gives young people authority and responsibility at an early age. And when I talk to CEOs and other executives now, I remind them that these young people are that they should give jobs to veterans, not because it's charity. These are the best people they can find anywhere. And many of them have had more authority and responsibility than they themselves have had. That they have an enormous amount to contribute because of their experience at a very early age. We had, after the Second World War, we went through, for a wide variety of reasons, the most successful era of economic prosperity in the history of the United States. And one of the reasons, I'm not a fan of single factor analysis, but certainly one of the independent variables here is the fact that the large majority of people had experience in wartime where they had a lot of authority and responsibility, and therefore were already geared up and ready to take the reins of leadership in civilian life. They also made the segue from being civilians to being military, from being military people to being civilians in pretty short order. That's why it's one of the reasons why we were so successful in the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s.
Could you share with us kind of I know your military career is very broad and there are many honors especially the Medal of Honor. Can you kind of go through an outline of your military career and share with us the leadership lessons that you've learned from this military career? I know that you speak with a lot of companies and that type of thing, and so we would really appreciate it if you would share your insight and thoughts on leadership.
Well, I worked very, very hard to stay at the lowest level of abstraction in the military. I never had very much interest in being on staff and being in an office. If I wanted to be in an office, I would never have come into the Army. So I was an infantry soldier the entire time I was in the Army, and left only because I got enticed to get out. When I was a colonel, I was 42 years old, making $40,000 a year. Had already put my daughter through college, had a son in college, and had another son I would have to put through college, and couldn't afford to be in the Army anymore. And got enticed to retire by a guy who had been a Marine A4 pilot, having served in Vietnam, and after about 8 years in the Marine Corps, left to go back to the family business in Wall Street, and knew that people who had been in uniform can do anything and learn anything in pretty short order. But the entire time, except for when I was in school in the military or teaching school in the military, I was in infantry units. So first assignment was in the 82nd Airborne Division in Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion Airborne, 505th Infantry. And that was at a time people were being shipped, officers, enlisted men were getting shipped in large numbers to Vietnam. And stateside units, including the 82nd Airborne Division, were not manned to the levels that they otherwise would be. My company commander, a guy who graduated from West Point in 1963 and had just come back from his first tour in Vietnam. He was later to go back, and he got killed in the second tour. Was my company commander. I reported to him. We had a chat in his office, and he said, okay, now you can get out of here. And I said, but sir, which platoon is mine? For people who are listening and don't know, a rifle company has 4 platoons of about 40 men each commanded by a lieutenant like me. I said, which platoon is mine? He said, you must be joking. We're the only officers in this company. They are all yours. And I went instantly from being responsible for absolutely positively nothing to being responsible for everything in the lives of about 150 men. Like I said, there's nothing like military service that gives young people authority and responsibility at an early age. Subsequently, we did get more NCOs and more officers, and I became one of the platoon leaders. But it taught me an enormous lesson about how you need to hit the ground running, always ask the question, what is it I'm trying to accomplish? And make sure that you understand what assets you have available in order to accomplish those things. If you do that, you're going to be in pretty good shape, whether you're in the military or you're in civilian life. And those lessons stood me in good stead later on when I retired from the Army and started doing other things. I became my company commander said that the battalion commander had decided after I'd been a platoon leader for a few months that he wanted me to be the S3 Air, it's the Air Operations Officer, which is it was a plum position, for a lieutenant. It's normally a captain who does this. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay with my platoon. I like being a platoon leader. I went to the battalion commander to argue that I should not be the S3 Air. Instead, I should stay as a platoon leader. He threw me out of his office. He didn't take any guff from lieutenants. And I reported immediately to my new boss, the S3, the battalion operations officer. My battalion commander had been an enlisted glider pilot on Normandy, survived the inevitable crash of his aircraft, got a battlefield commission, and as a company commander, jumped into Nijmegen, the disastrous airborne operation, the bridge too far. And when he was my battalion commander, ultimately he became my battalion commander, he really did have a low threshold of pain for wise guy fools like me. But I learned a great deal about command, about leadership, about focusing your attention on knowing what it is you want to accomplish and then going ahead and accomplishing it. I was chagrined to realize some years later that he was only about 22 or 23 years older than I. And he was a guy who'd fought on Normandy, jumped into Nijmegen, was an old airborne soldier and was only a little bit older than I was. A very tragic realization. But I learned a great deal, and all the time I was an infantry soldier. I was a battalion executive officer. I became a battalion commander. I taught at West Point. The Army sent me to graduate school, and then I taught international relations and comparative politics at West Point. And a lot of the people who had been cadets of mine ultimately grew up to be great and famous Americans at the top of the food chain. Ray Odierno, God bless him, now gone, was a cadet of mine when he was a first classman, a senior at West Point, and he grew up to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Marty Dempsey, also one of my cadets, grew up to be Ray Odierno grew up to be Chief Staff of the Army, and Marty Dempsey grew up to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I had a wide variety of other cadets who wound up in senior leadership positions in the Army. And I knew then, I mean, I was just a major at the time when these guys were cadets. I knew then that if you were going to influence the future, if you're going to have any effect on the future, the only way you can do it is through close contact and education. It's the only way you can reach on the future, and that it was vitally important. I even recognized back then when I was relatively young that if I were going to make sure that the Army was the best Army it could be, I'd better have a positive impact on these young cadets and young soldiers when I was in leadership positions myself, because at some juncture they were going to take over, and I had better teach them what I knew. Otherwise, they would have to learn all that stuff on the go. So I dedicated myself to making sure that they knew what I knew, for good or ill, and in many cases it turned out to be for good.
I wondered when you were sharing that story if at some point with some of the really bright young men that you had in your charge, if you found yourself really jumping to stay ahead of some and then bringing others along. How did you manage that?
Well, they were all students when I was teaching, and some were really, really good students, and others were not so good students. The large majority of them obviously were in the middle. But we also had, don't forget, we also had a common bond. We were all in uniform. They were about ready to go serve like I had served when I was young. Jump from being students to being responsible for everything in the lives of a bunch of other men. And so it was vitally important that I teach them what I had learned in the years before I met them. And I still do that. I still teach at West Point. And I teach money and banking to kids who are majoring in economics, and mass media and American politics to kids who are majoring in American politics. The curriculum there has changed dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years. But at the end of the day, they're A, still kids, and B, still soldiers. So I try to teach them not just how to calculate M2 and what the utility of the central bank is and all the rest of that. But I also try to teach them how to be soldiers. Information about which they are ravenous. Some people make a mistake of not imparting the things that they know to the people who work for them, and that's a bad idea. You got to tell them everything you know, because someday they're going to have to tell everything they know to somebody who's going to take over from them. We can't be reticent about telling people what we know and how they should act and what they should do, because it's extremely dangerous to have to reinvent the wheel every generation. When we do that, we always do not like the outcome.
Did you find that, I'm just curious, did you find that the students who were getting it quickly helped the students who might have struggled just a little bit more or were slower learners? I'm just thinking a rising tide lifts all boats, and servant leaders lift each other up, just as you said. And I was just wondering if you saw that in the military more than you see now.
Yes. I don't know about whether or not it's the same in the military as it was then. I suspect it was, because the environment is conducive to doing exactly what you're talking about, and making sure that everybody understands what has to be done and how to do it. And the people who are really skilled, even if they're at the same level or even at a lower level of command, everybody makes sure that everybody around them understands the basic principles of leadership, what you need to do in order to be technically and tactically expert, and how you can improve the functioning of your unit. Because it was who was it? It was Benjamin Franklin, who just before the Revolution wrote, "We either hang together or we will surely hang separately." He wasn't kidding then, and it still applies today. And I think in the military environment, we work very, very hard to make sure that everybody knows as much as he possibly can. Look, officers always consult non-commissioned officers who are at a lower level in the chain of command, but may know a heck of a lot more and have had a lot more experience, or have had a lot of experience, but in different environments, and have a great deal to offer. One of the things that we do in the military that they don't necessarily do in civilian life is that we make sure that people at all levels offer their opinion on the mission, on how to accomplish the mission. You're required to do that. And if you don't do that, more fool you, and you have not, if you don't tell your boss what you think, whether he takes the advice or not, you're not performing your job. In civilian life, we see that far less. One of the things I try to do is to make sure that civilian leaders understand that not only works in civilian life, but it's absolutely essential. You need to surround yourself with good people. And if they're good at what they do, they also have to be good at making sure that you understand what they know, that they offer their opinion, that you solicit their opinion, and that you work together to achieve a common goal. We see that in organizations, I've seen this, but in organizations in civilian life that are high performing, that's what they do. Organizations that are not high performing, one of the things they fail to do is exactly that. And this, by the way, this is in business and in government as well. People who are poor leaders surround themselves with yes men. And people who are good leaders surround themselves with people who will tell you if you have spinach stuck between your teeth, if you have spinach stuck between your teeth, and won't pull any punches because they understand that what's really important is not you or what people think about you. What's really important is whether or not the organization does what it's supposed to do and accomplishes its mission. Lousy organizations are usually run by lousy leaders, so don't do any of the things that we're just talking about.
Let's pause for just a moment to hear from one of our great sponsors.
Hello, this is Jay Zacharias with the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum, and I would like to tell you about one of our partner sponsors. His name is Justin Krieger, and he has worked as an independent insurance agent at Krieger Insurance Agency in his hometown of Hobart, Oklahoma since 1999. Justin is honored to help with the annual Celebration of Freedom event and has been a board member for the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum for many years. He is also a fifth-generation farmer and rancher in Kiowa County, where cattle, crops, and even insurance is sold with a handshake. Give him a call at 580-726-3076 or come by the office if you would like to speak with Justin Krieger or Kathy Lankford about insurance. We are thankful to our customers and friends who have supported us through the years. Again, Justin would like to say how honored he is to live in such a great country and how proud he is to help sponsor these podcasts. Please enjoy the rest of this podcast experience from your friends at Krieger Insurance Agency.
Now let's get back to our episode.
So I think it was really valuable to you to take the leadership that you learned in the military to your business career in and later life. Would you like to, and you've kind of elaborated on that a little bit. I know that you have written a book, if not now, when? Duty and Sacrifice in America's Time of Need. Would you share a little bit about that and what inspired you to write the book?
I had a friend, now gone, who I had known for a long time. He had been a boxer. He grew up in New York City, too. Had been an actor, a producer. He had written also. He was a multi-talented guy. I met him through mutual friends, through the military connection. And he grabbed me one day and said, "You need to write a book." I said, "I don't know. I need to read books, but I'm not going to write a book." He said, No, you need to write a memoir. And I'm taking you to a couple of publishers, and whoever gives you the biggest bid, we're going to take the money and you're going to write the book. And that's exactly what happened. I started getting into it, and I enjoyed the heck out of it. It's one of those, like writing is like a lot of tasks. There's a lot of inertia involved. Once you overcome the inertia, it's hard to stop. And it was an enjoyable experience. And I think it was a useful thing to do. It's still in print. And I think has made a contribution to understanding what brings people to the military, why people get out of the military, and how they translate what they learned in the military to civilian life. It's basically a memoir. Well, it's not basically, it is a memoir. And I had a lot of fun writing it. One of the reasons it was fun was that I hadn't thought about many of the things that are in the book before. you go through life and you put one foot in front of the other. It's Monday, and then you finish Monday, and you do Tuesday, and so on. You never say never or always, because that's baloney. But you rarely look back and say, wow, what was it that happened, and what did I learn from it? You sort of assume that your brain that's a computer, will process all of that stuff and effectively and efficiently make you do things in the future that reflect your experience in the past. But we all know that's the older we get, the more we know that's baloney. You actually have to think about what it is that you have learned so that you can process it properly. And so that was a useful exercise for me to write that memoir. It was a great deal of fun.
And I can see how that would have been inspiring to you once you got into it and really thought about it and reflected on the experience and what you learned. It probably created, as you said, a great deal of momentum to share that once you were able to kind of put it together and it made sense to you and you had a lot of realization what you learned and kind of could put some things in categories and understand the leadership lessons that you truly learned in that. You also published Surviving Boot Camp and Basic Training. And this is oral histories of those who've gone through Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Force initial training. Can you share about that? And then if their basic training was different, maybe share with us what the benefits of their typical basic training was.
Well, basic training back in the day was quite a bit different in a lot of respects than it is now. It's men and women are integrated in basic training, for one thing. We didn't have any women who went through basic training, or even not very many who actually served with men back in the day. Now we have a fairly substantial cohort of women in just about all of the military occupational specialties. That wasn't the case back then. Somebody I can't remember who it was, came up with the idea that I do this and interviewed a large number of young men and women who were going into the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and then subsequently came out at the other end. And what were their recollections about what they learned? How did they feel, and so on? And of course, nothing's, particularly in retrospect, nothing is funnier than military service when you think about what you went through, what you did, and with whom you went through it. And most of them are amusing and many of them enlightening anecdotes. Eventually, this wound up as a series, produced a series called 10 Weeks on Roku. It was originally done for Katzenberg's Quibi platform, and then Roku bought all of the content on that platform. And we followed a cohort of kids going through basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, focused on about 5 or 6 of these kids. And when I say kids, they run the gamut from relatively young, I mean, just not even out of their teens, to people in their early 30s, all coming into the Army for different reasons. I really want to serve. I've thought about this since I was young. From that all the way to I have no idea what I'm going to do with myself, and I just come off a divorce, and I'm a single parent, and I've got to change my life. I'm going to join the Army, and everything in between. A really enlightening look at why people get into uniform and how they are welded into a coherent and cohesive group of people who can accomplish any mission that you give them and are intensely focused on doing exactly that. They come from all over. I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about the Second World War. 20 million people from all over the country, from all walks of life and all backgrounds, all welded into a war machine that defeated the Axis. This is sort of the same thing here. People coming into the Army for all kinds of reasons, and all of a sudden they're a machine. They're a machine. And you give them something to do, and they will do two things. They will work hard to achieve that mission, number one, and number two, they will take care of each other. 10 weeks earlier, they never would have done that. Now they will. It was an enlightening experience as well for them and for people looking at it.
So am I right in saying that regardless if it's Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard, what it teaches is teamwork and a brotherhood of working together to take care of each other?
Yeah, that's the end product. The end product is somebody who, whatever his background, can do anything, any mission that you hand to this person, and will do it together with other people. Often people they have never met before, but they're going to do it, and they're going to do it together, and they're going to take care of each other. I don't think you can get that anywhere else. Matter of fact, I know it.
I believe you, and I think about how it reflects on your childhood and the sense of community that you had growing up, that same community in the military. And that's something that in our leadership program, which we just completed last week, which is really outstanding. We put students in groups, and they really come together to work on some of their ethics topics that they are given and speech, and they really support each other and help each other. And then those students stay connected after they leave our program, because it is a tough week. And they say, gosh, this is really hard. I said, yes, it is hard, but you can get it done, and you can come out on the other side better for it and proud of yourself for having completed what we put in front of you during this week. So share with us about, you're also a military analyst for NBC and MSNBC. Can you share with us some of your experiences there and what that's meant to you?
Well, I'm very lucky to have fallen into a position where I can, and have for 20 years now, I've been able to pass on my understanding of what's taking place in national security to people, the large majority of whom don't necessarily know anything about it, but want to know about it. And so I have a sort of even-tempered and even-handed way of looking at things. I'm a just the facts buddy kind of person, and insist on talking about only those things I have some understanding of. But I joined NBC at the start of the war in Iraq, and have been there ever since. Sometimes talking about tactics, sometimes talking about strategy, and sometimes talking about larger strategic and national security questions, information about which I can either find or I already know from my experience in the Army. I taught at the National War College for a number of years, and therefore had to and have retained a fairly good understanding of some of the larger questions about national security and national security issues that are problems for the United States and our allies. So it's been great. They put a studio in my office in my home about 6 or 7 years ago, because I live in New Jersey, and it was easier for them to call up and say, "Are you at home?" "Yes." "Well, get in front of a camera." Then they're telling me, "Are you at home?" "Well, we got to send a car to come collect you. It's going to be 2 hours before you get in front of a camera," and so on. This way it makes it's administratively and logistically much easier. But it also makes me available whenever. I mean, technology is a great thing now. It makes me, I can be just about anywhere and go on the air very, very quickly. And frequently, it won't be anything planned. Something will happen that's been unplanned, and I can get right on the air and talk about it.
I know you're a great asset to them And it helps the rest of us to understand, as you said, that have no idea about what they're trying to accomplish and why they would be doing certain things. Can you tell us a little bit about the Code of Support Foundation that you work on? Your military nonprofit service organization?
Yeah, I'm involved in a number of military nonprofits. I think it's important that we do that, especially in an environment in which most people don't know anybody in uniform, like I said. And when people get out of the service, or even those who are in, require assistance. One of the things we forget is that let me back up a second. When I first came in the Army, a private in the Army made $78 a month. I was a lieutenant. I made $222.10 a month. I had a wife and 2 children to support. That wasn't even a lot of money back in those days. And as a result of that, being married, having a family, was inconsistent with being in the military. I had senior non-commissioned officers living in my barracks because you really couldn't afford to be married. All that's changed now. And while pay in the military is still lags behind, I'm pretty sure still lags behind. Oh, for sure now lags behind that in the civilian community, especially when you balance it with how much authority and responsibility military people have. There's a significant percentage of our people in uniform who have the responsibility of families. And so we not only have men and women in the military, we have families who are in the military too. And because we're spread so thinly, and many of our service members are deployed not only frequently, but almost all the time, unlike 55 years ago when I came in the service. It's important that we make sure that we take care of not just servicemen, but we also take care of their families, and we take care of them not only when they're in the service, but also when they get out of the service, because times are much different than they were after the Second World War or even after Vietnam. We have an obligation to these people, and most of the veterans I know are in one way or another involved in nonprofit organizations that seek to benefit military people and their families.
I've seen that, and I've done a lot of digging into mental toughness, and I was reading a lot, listening a lot to a gentleman named Dr. Jim Lauer, who is founded the Center for Human Performance. And what he found through years and years and research through hundreds of people was that we have to be an elite performer, and follow me on this, please. You have to have energy. Energy comes from your nutrition, your sleep, even your spiritual health. It feeds into the energy to have the character that you have, and your character is what gives you the drive and determination and the discipline to be an elite performer. But when an elite performer achieves all the things they want to achieve, what they find is they're never fulfilled until they start giving back to whatever organization it is that they feel the closest to. And that's what we try to share with our young students is leadership is about looking around your community and having a realization of what things need to be, what issues need to resolve, what things need to be fixed. How can I help? That's what leadership is all about. And recognizing those things and coming up with a plan, just as you said, you learned in your early leadership was seeing what needs to be accomplished and having a plan and working through your plan. And that's an important part, I think, of leadership, is being able to recognize and then develop a plan and then take action through your plan. So is that something that you have some thoughts on?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. One is the observation by Lewis Carroll, who I think, Through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland, wrote, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." We frequently throw assets at a problem without thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve. And one of the things you learn in the Army is that you can't tell a private in the Army to do anything unless you first articulate to them what it is we're trying to do. And yet, I frequently see in the military, in business, in government, people throwing assets at a problem without starting at the end and working backwards. Because otherwise, you're not going to know whether or not you've achieved anything. Frequently, we do this because we perceive we're in some sort of crisis and we've got to do something, even if it's wrong, and it invariably turns out to be wrong because we don't spend any time trying to figure out what it is we're trying to do. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second, when you were talking about giving back, it also applies to not just to charities, but even in the environment in which we're working. You mentioned the title of my memoir, If Not Now, When? That comes from an observation of a first century Hebrew scholar named Hillel. I won't bore anybody with the run up to it, but he basically said, if not you, who? And if not now, when? That is, if you're not going to do it, who's going to do it? And anybody who's been in combat knows that this is the case, because you're in a difficult situation and something's got to be done. It's got to be done right now. And if somebody doesn't do it, if somebody doesn't rise to the occasion, all is lost. People in the military know this, particularly those who fought in combat. But most people don't realize that because they have rarely been in a situation in which they have to prepare for and then act in situations that are the worst that you can imagine. We often don't do that. We have to teach people how to do that, how to not throw assets at just about anything. You know, if you're working for somebody who says everything's a crisis, well, then nothing's a crisis. A crisis is a very specific set of circumstances, and you need to. I think one of the things that differentiate people who are good leaders from those who are not so good leaders is the ability to distinguish between situations that are crises and more or less everyday situations that are just unpleasant. Because how you allocate resources is different from that. Hold on a second. Sorry. I'm going to have to go soon, actually. Because how you act in the crisis situation is very much different from those situations that are not crises. But in any case, no matter what you do, you better plan. And people don't like to plan because it's too much trouble. It makes their brains hurt. You have to overcome mental and physical inertia in order to do that. You have to find people around you who can do it for you and follow your guidance, and that's a pain. And it's just too complicated. And I'd prefer to go restring my tennis racket. But at the end of the day, if you don't do that, you're going to find yourself in a difficult situation and you're not going to be able to respond. We see this all the time. We've seen this in the military often. You can take a look at any of the missions which we've tried to accomplish, for which we planned poorly. And the lousy planning, one discovers on examination, is the proximate cause for the failure. We got to not do that anymore, and we have to teach people how to start at the end and work backwards.
I think that's great advice, because if you don't have a plan and you don't have an end result that you're trying to achieve, how can you go to, say, a sponsor or anyone that you want to? Projects require capital, so typically, and they require labor and they also require capital typically. So if you go to a prospective sponsor or you're trying to raise funds for something, you've got to be able to share what is it you're trying to accomplish, and what is your plan? How do you plan to accomplish this? So I think that's very important and very wise advice for our listeners and our students. Is there anything, I know that your time is limited, so we'll wrap up. Is there anything that you would like to say to our young leaders that you might say to your young self as some advice to kind of wrap up our discussion?
Well, I'll reiterate something I said earlier, because most young leaders eventually grow up to be older leaders. And it's very easy for us to be comfortable by surrounding ourselves with people who are like us, who think like us, and who agree with us. That's the worst thing you can possibly do. You got to surround yourself with good people, no matter what their backgrounds or their opinions are. And unless you do that, you're going to not only make mistakes, you're going to make really bad mistakes. And worse yet, you're going to make them over and over again. The most important thing, I think, if you had to pick one thing, is as a leader to surround yourself with the best people you can find.
And I think even in your friendship circle, it's important to have people that you can bounce things off of, that will keep you accountable for what you want to achieve and what you're trying to do. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. The people you're closest to, they've got to be able to speak their minds. I'm reminded of an observation by Oscar Wilde, who once wrote, "Nobody is a hero to his wife or his valet." If you're close enough with people and they're good people and they're honest, they will give you the straight dope. People with whom you're not so close and who are in their positions because they want to be there, it's a step up for them, or you have them there because they agree with you. Those are the worst people in the world. Yeah, people who you're really close to will more than likely tell you you're doing something stupid when you're doing something stupid.
Accountability. So community accountability are some great things to think about in our leadership. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your time. I know our students and our listeners will benefit greatly from the information and the wisdom of your life experience that you've shared. And thank you. We appreciate you very much.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
You're so welcome.
Thank you again to REI Oklahoma for making this podcast possible. For nearly 40 years, the board, staff, patrons, and supporters of the nonprofit economic development REI Oklahoma are committed to expanding Oklahoma's economic prosperity, earning the reputation of being one of the most comprehensive economic development organizations in the country. Business loans, training workshops, business consulting, and networking opportunities, as well as technical assistance and even commercial business space, are made available to Oklahoma entrepreneurs and small businesses. For low and moderate income individuals and families, down payment and or closing cost assistance is offered. Learn more at reiok.org. This has been the 4-Star Leadership Podcast. Now it's your turn, 4-Star listeners. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and let us know what you thought of this episode. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast and tune in next month for our next episode that airs every last Friday each month. Go be great.
The LaBarre family is a 4th-generation Oklahoma family. That may not sound like a long time, but our grandfathers were born here, within the Comanche Nation, before the land runs. We are the proudest sponsor of the Tommy Franks 4-Star Leadership Podcast. We hope listeners will heed the words of these distinguished men and women who have served our country at the highest levels and across all walks of life.